Well, today we're going to be continue to look at the story of David and Goliath and some of the things that happened. Today we're actually going to, take the story a little bit farther and see some of the aftermath of what happened. Because the reality of it is David fighting Goliath was just one small part of the grand story in the life of David as king and everything he did. This was, in a way, a launch pad for him. And because he was willing to stand and he was willing to fight Goliath, he was willing to make that decision, it was a springboard into more. See, there's things that happen when you decide that you're going to face a giant. And there's even more that happens when you do it, and you do it victoriously, and you win, as David did. So today we're going to ask the question, actually this week and next week we're going to be looking at this question: what happens after the battle? What happens afterwards? The story of David and Goliath is that great, wonderful, epic story where, it comes to the conclusion and David knocked Goliath over, then came over and cut the guy's head off, and we see this incredible thing. This David won. He beat all the odds. All this stuff happened. And I don't know if you're like me or not, but whenever I watch an epic story, especially, movies, I love a good epic movie. Whenever the movie kind of ends, you sit there and go, well, then what happened? Right? Does anyone else do that? I mean, you see like the grand conflict and all of this, and in the end, the hero gets the girl or whatever, and you're like, and then what happened? Like, what happened next? I mean, especially the ones when it's like they left it open for a sequel. Do you know what I'm talking about? And then never make the sequel. I hate that so much. Because you're sitting there and you're going, what happened? What happened afterwards? What happened to the characters? What happened to these characters in this thing, What happens next? Fortunately, we actually get to see what happens next with David. And I actually believe there are some striking similarities to what happens in our own life after we have faced a giant, after we have fought a battle like David fought. And just to recap it real quick, Goliath was this monster of a man, 9 foot 9 inches tall, who came out twice a day for 40 days challenging the nation of Israel. Send someone to fight me. David shows up and says, fine, I'll be that guy. I'll fight him. And they tried to convince him not to. Then they tried to change him, made him put on armor, trying to do that. And he said, no, I've got to do this. But David realized that it wasn't him really fighting, that it was Goliath versus God, right? That David was on God's side. David was going to be used by God to do all of these things. So we kind of see all of that. And then last week we saw the kind of that grand epic finale of David killing Goliath. And so let's look at what happens afterwards. Because in the story of David, it really is just the beginning. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're going to start at verse 50. So 1 Samuel 17, verse 50. It says, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Let's keep looking a little bit. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistine fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. It's an interesting thing that happens when you face a giant, especially when you face a giant and you win. You're not the only one who will benefit from your victory. In the story of David and Goliath, when David won, all of a sudden all of the Philistines realized their champion was dead, and now by all rights they should be slaves to Israel. That was the agreement, right? If one of your men kill me, we'll be your servants. If I kill him, you'll be ours. Well, instead of sticking around to, get the shackles and everything, they take off running. They retreat in a big way. And all of a sudden, all of these men who have been standing around for 40 days, listening to Goliath challenge them, suddenly have courage to go and fight. They see that the monster is down, and they have courage, and they follow the Philistines, pursuing them and killing them all the way to Gath. And I think that is incredibly fitting, because Gath was the home of Goliath. And so they kill Goliath, and the army of Israel goes and follows them all the way up, so that all of them know, we killed your champion. We killed Goliath. And then they come back and they plunder the camp. That's what you did. You killed the enemy, you came back and you took their stuff, right? That's how you got rich. That was the pay for the soldiers. And so they were doing this, and they came back. You'll have to excuse me, I've got a tickle in my throat today. You see, David was not the only one who benefited from killing Goliath. All the people around him began to benefit. All the people around him suddenly were bolstered with courage. All the people around him got to share in the plunder, even though they were unwilling to go out. And I honestly believe this. When you are willing to stand and face your giant, and you have victory over your giant because you've realized that God made you for that, God has prepared you for it. God has done all of these things in order to equip you to face your giant, and you realize you're just working on God's behalf, and so you defeat your giant. People around you in your life will benefit from that. People will benefit. In my own life, I got to see this very clearly. My grandfather was an alcoholic. Bad alcoholic. So was a good portion of my dad's family. My dad has borderline horror stories of being taken to Bourbon Street in New Orleans, left out on the road with a bouncer of a strip club who he had never met. My dad rode around the city on the back of this guy's motorcycle while his dad bar hopped. That was my grandfather. My only memories of my grandfather are him with the great big pot belly from the amount of alcohol he had. I later found out that he was not allowed to come to our home because of some of the things that had happened. Now, my dad grew up in that home. My dad grew up in a very dysfunctional home in that sense. Okay, my dad actually, for a while, he would tell us that he was an alcoholic for a time. When he was younger, the fun thing to do that they would do is they would all go to the bar and let's see who can outdrink Tommy. That was my dad. He was the one people would try to drink more than. According to him, they never won. That was my dad. Then my dad came to know Jesus. His life radically changed, and he gave up alcohol. My dad faced a giant back then that I got to reap the benefits of. You see, one of the wonderful things about when you face your giant is the people that are closest to you will benefit from that. And your giant could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be divorce. It could be any of these things. And when you're willing to stand and say, no, this is where I take my ground, this is where I stand, this is where I fight, not only do you benefit from it, but your children benefit, your grandchildren benefit, and it goes on for generations. Think about my dad's decision to not be an alcoholic. I grew up in an incredible home. I did. I hear horror stories of some people and the life that they came out of and how their parents were and this and that. It's a horror story in every sense of the word. And some of you probably came out of that type of a deal. But because my dad was willing to stand and say, I'm going to face this giant, I never had to worry about Dad coming home drunk. I never did. I never had to see that. I never had to try to drag my dad in off the ground or out of the yard or any of the things like I've heard. Never had to worry about my dad coming home at 2 in the morning smelling like booze. Why? Because he stood up and faced his giant. Instead, I had confidence that my dad was the strongest man in the world. And I had confidence in my dad and who he was. And because my dad made that choice, my kids don't have to grow up with a grandfather who's an alcoholic and not allowed to come over. I'm fully confident in taking my children to stay with Grammy and Papa for a week or 2 or 3 with full confidence because my dad stood up to his giant. When you stand up to a giant, other people benefit. When you give in, they suffer. You see, suddenly when you put more on the line like that, it gives you more of a reason to fight. Right? There are so many times where if I'm struggling with something, where I will look at my kids and go, the decisions I make will affect them. Who do I want them to see me as? Do I want them to see me run, or do I want them to see me stand and fight? And it gives me courage. It helps me to understand that this is worth fighting for. When you face your giant, you are not the only one that benefits. But then something else will also happen. People will join themselves to you. When you take a stand and you do something and you fight a giant and win, you fight a giant in your life and you win, people notice. They see it. And they want to know how. They want to know why. They want to know. They will actually come and join themselves to you. And the difficult part is some of them will join themselves to you for good and some for bad. When they say you're willing to take a stand on something, people will be attracted to that. See, in our society, in our culture right now, nobody stands for anything. I mean, really. There's so many things that are coming around that we see where people just flip-flop on what they believe, what they say, what they do. They'll tell you one thing and then do another because, well, I don't want to offend somebody. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. Instead of standing on a truth and saying, no, this is where I stand. And I will not be moved. People are actually attracted to that more than they are someone who's wishy-washy. People will join themselves to you, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. I want us to look at some of the people who joined themselves to David for good. The ones who came alongside David because he inspired them, because he proved who he was, the kind of man and the kind of leader he was. You watch a kid knock down a giant, guess what? I'm following that guy. You know, if I see someone who's bold enough to yell out at a 9-foot-tall Philistine and say, today I will cut off your head, and then does it, I want to follow that guy, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but it's too many times we see the guys who stand there and say, I'm going to cut off your head, and then when the time comes to grab the sling or the sword, they're nowhere to be found. People want to see the action of it. And when they actually see you do something, they see you stand, they see you make a change, they will gravitate towards you for that. And let me make this point very clear. I'm not telling you all of this so that you can be a magnificent leader, so that you can be a very popular individual, so that any of that. No. I'm telling you this because when you are obedient to God, you face your giants, God will begin to send other people your direction so that more glory can be given to God. It's all about Him, not about you. Okay? You are nothing more than an instrument to be used by God to bring Him glory, both through your own life and through the lives of those who come and join themselves to you. Okay? I just want to make that very, very clear. I'm not trying to help you get on top of the popularity charts. That's not the goal. Instead, it's to make God more popular. But let's look at what happens. Sorry, I got my notes and slides all mixed up today with typos and all. That's all right. So let's jump to 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 3. In the span in between where we just finished and now, we see that Saul the king has been asking, who is this young man? Who is this kid who went out, and what is his family? Tell me a little bit about him. Now, he already knew David. David had been serving in his courts for some time, playing the harp and the lyre in order to appease Saul, because Saul was tormented by evil spirits because he rebelled against God. Okay? So Saul knew who David was. He was trying to find out more about him. And so he has a conversation with David, and as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan. Jonathan was King Saul's son, the eldest son who would be the heir to the throne of Israel. The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, took him being David, that day, and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. See, when people will see what you're doing, people see how strong you are. They see that you're willing to stand. They see that you're willing to fight. They will join themselves to you both for good and for bad. And we see that right here. We're going to talk more about how deep that can go for someone like Saul, because Saul became obsessed with David, but not in a good way. And we're going to talk more about how sometimes when you stand and you fight, you will actually draw the attention of people who want evil for you instead of good. Okay, you've got to be aware of that. But we're going to talk about that next week. But this week, let's look at how standing and facing a giant will actually draw people to you. Okay? So Jonathan was one of them. Jonathan, the firstborn son of King Saul, the one who would take over the crown, the one who would do all this. The interesting thing about Jonathan is later on, he is so loyal to David, so loyal to this guy that he would even rebel against his own father, would even help David escape so that Saul couldn't kill him. He would actually go to his own father and try to convince him not to go after David, not to do these things. And at one point, Jonathan looks at David and tells him, and this is a shocking statement when you think about it. Jonathan looks at David and says, I know that you will be king over Israel, and I will stand at your side. Now think about that for a little bit. The one who by all rights should become king when Saul dies is standing there looking at him saying, I will follow you. I will stand at your side, not have you stand at mine. You will be king because God is with you. When people see that you are willing to stand and face a giant, and you're going to be victorious because God gives you the victory, and you're doing all of it right, the right way, the right heart, the right attitude, people will sacrifice things just to be close to you because they want what you have. They want what you have. I mean, think about it. Think about it. What do you mean you were able to beat your addiction? What do you mean you were able to get out of drugs? What do you mean you were able to fight for your marriage? How have you been married 50 years? How is it that when your husband or wife cheated on you, you didn't run and hide and leave? How is it you came out of an abusive house and then came out to be good? How is it your entire family's alcoholics, but you're not? People want to know. Because here's the reality. Here's something that we all need to understand. Every single person you will ever meet is facing a giant. Every one of them. And the vast majority of them are standing there going, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fight this. I don't know how to get over this. If you don't believe me, go look at the self-help section in the library. Really. Or go onto Amazon and just do self-help and see how many thousands of books are there. I mean, some of them are just weird, right? But people want anything. They want anything. And they're willing to ask, they're willing to look. You see, the truth of the matter is that giant slayers are worth following. Giant slayers are worth following. There's no reason that they're not. If you see someone kill a 9-foot 9-inch guy when you're a teenager, that's someone you want to follow. And here's the incredible thing. When you've got someone like that you're going to follow, it will attract a certain caliber of people who themselves are then willing to fight, who are then themselves willing to do incredible feats. Why? Because they saw how God worked in you. And if God worked in you that way, then I know He can help me in this way also. Here's some of the people. I don't know why my notes got all messed up when I printed them this morning. Oh well. I'll do the best I can. Some of the people who were willing to follow David. Okay, we see this in the book of 2 Samuel near the end of David's life, where he begins recounting some of the ones who have helped him, some of the ones who have been with him. Of course, Jonathan was willing to give up his own kingdom, his crown, and all of it in order to follow. He was willing to sacrifice so much, but Jonathan never had the opportunity. He died in battle at a young age. And it was actually in a way so that David could step in to be king without ripping the nation apart. So Jonathan never actually had the opportunity to do that, but there were other men who came alongside David and followed him. And these were men of incredible renown. These were people who have incredible stories. I'm not going to try to give you the names because most of them are very weird, but I'll tell you the stories. Okay, these are men who came and found David after he was running from Saul. David's living in caves, fleeing for his life, and all of these men start gathering around him. And he gets some incredible warriors who no doubt were at the battle, or at least heard the legend of David versus Goliath. You've got one guy who took a spear and in a single battle killed over 700 men. You've got another one who stood side by side with David while the entire armies fled. And just David and this one other were able to rout the entire Philistine army. I mean, these are crazy guys. You've got another one who stood fighting for so long, so hard, that his hand literally was frozen to his sword so that he could not release it. You've got probably one of my favorite stories is that of Benaiah. He's the one that, he's the namesake for my youngest. Benaiah, who chased a lion down into a pit on a snowy day and killed it. These were men of incredible renown. These were men who, because they saw what David was able to do, I mean, just think. They're following the giant killer, right? Dang, if you can kill a giant, I'll kill a lion, right? If you're leading the armies, I will fight to the death for the one who killed giants. Why? Because I believe this man to be used by God. These were people who came alongside David, and David led them for God's glory, not his own. One of the stories of three of the men, he had several groups. There was a group of 3 men who were the most elite fighters. I just told you several of their stories. And these 3 men, at one point, David says, "How I wish I could have a drink from the well in Bethlehem." These 3 men go in and raid a city that's held captive by the Philistines and get the water and bring it back to David. By the way, let me just say this, okay? For all of you men out there who love these kind of stories, I love these stories. These stories are like the dreams of, they need to make movies. But there's actually a guy who has written these stories and done an incredible job. If you want more information about him, let me know. His name's Cliff Graham. He is a veteran, has served in the Middle East, knows the actual fields where David fought Goliath and the caves where David hid. And he talks about some of the stuff, and he's pieced it all together in Scripture, and it's absolutely incredible. But these 3 men would go and they got the water and brought it back to David. Now, this was even during a drought time. And they came and they brought the water to... These guys just almost died, right? But they were so loyal, so willing that they did this, brought it back, and David took the water and said, "This is such a great sacrifice that I'm not worthy of it." And then he took the water and did the unthinkable, and he poured it out on the ground and said, "I'm not worthy of this. God, this is for you." David remained true the whole time. Now, they didn't always understand why David would do what he did. They didn't always agree with him. And when you face a giant and people start coming around you, they will try to sway you to do things that they think you should do. And it's not that they're evil intent. It's not that they're trying to manipulate you. But they believe in who you are. They believe in these things, and they want to see great things in you because they follow you. This could be your husband, your wife, your children, any of them, your grandchildren, your co-workers. They see you stand and fight for a giant or fight against a giant, and they want to follow. There's one story near the end of 2 Samuel that is hidden within Scripture, and I don't think it gets talked about very much, but I find it incredibly fascinating. There came a point where David has been king for many years. He's nearing the end of his life, but he was a warrior. He still would go out to battle. He was one of the guys that was like, no, I'm not staying. I'm going to go fight. And as he went, they came and they fought the Philistines one more time. And they went to Gath, the city that Goliath was from. And Goliath had brothers. We don't always think about that, but he did. And there were giants other than Goliath, who was already dead, but there were giants in that city. And the interesting thing is this time, nobody ran. Nobody fled. They didn't stand on two sides of a hill while the giants came out and mocked them. They were serving the giant slayer. They were serving and following the giant killer. The one who had already killed the champion of Gath. And in fact, one of them, it's kind of funny, but one of the soldiers under David actually followed David's lead and killed another one with a sling. And there were multiple men who rushed into battle. Why? Because they followed the giant slayer. If you will face your giants, if you will stand up and fight for your marriage, you will fight your addiction, you will fight for righteousness and holiness, if you will stand and fight and do what God has called you to do, you will give other people the courage to stand and fight their own giants. See, when we all stand and see the giants in our own life, we believe them to be impossible. But when you actually fight one and you know someone who's fought it, and you saw someone who won, it's not impossible anymore. It's not impossible. The biggest question that you've got to ask yourself, and this is the question I've been posing to you the whole time, are you willing to stand and fight? Are you willing to face your giant? Are you willing to defeat that sin in your life? Are you willing to fight for your marriage? Are you willing to fight for your children? Are you willing to fight for that life that God has for you? Are you willing to stand up for what's right? Are you willing to be unshaking and unmoving so that God can receive all of the glory, all of the honor, all of the praise? It's not about you. It's not about me. I've been reading a book here recently. Well, I say reading, I've been listening to it. I listen to audiobooks. By Mark Batterson called Chase the Lion. Incredible. And God has been challenging me. It's so funny. With this sermon series, the book I've been reading, and then yesterday I get in the car and I listen to the radio, and it's a brand new song I've never heard, and I don't have a clue who sang it. I don't even know the name. But one of the phrases in there was, God, when did I make you so small? Think about it. When did we make God small? When did we sit there and say, God will only do what I'm capable of doing? Because, and you might say, no, that's not true, but that's how we live. We believe that God will only accomplish through us what we're capable of doing. David had no chance against Goliath. I mean, come on. By himself, David was dog food. He would not have made it. But because David recognized, I serve the God of the universe, he was able to stand and defeat his giant and then encourage others to do the same. Be giant slayers. Face your giant and have confidence that God will help you in that. Have confidence that God will do that for you. It will not only benefit you, but it'll benefit your entire family.